So this is a pretty small thing, but this margin top and margin bottom, at least in this case, is always going to be the same. If we decide we're going to change it to 5 pixels on one, it'll be 5 pixels on the other. And part of the reason why we're using a preprocessor is to reduce repetition and being able to link up values that are related to one another. So in this case, what we can do is use a variable instead of defining this number twice. So if we did something like this, margin 3 pixels, then we could copy this variable and paste it in here and paste it in here. And if you saved this and refreshed it in the browser, you should see no changes. But if we changed it to 10 pixels here and refreshed, you'd see the margin change. Now, in previous versions of SASS, that is before version 3.4, you had to be more careful with these variables because, say, previously in your SASS you had defined a margin variable already. By using this margin variable here, it would override that variable, and so any later usage of that variable would use the overridden version. However, now, variables are, by default, scoped to the block that they're being used in. And the block is simply what's between the starting and ending brackets. So for example, because we're setting margin right here in this block, we can't use it in this block out here. If we tried, and we saved it, we'd get an error because the variable was undefined. However, if we defined margin in an outermost block, so for example, we defined margin right here in the site footer, and then we used it inside of a nested block, and we saved it and went back to the browser and refreshed, you'd see that we can use it. And if we took this variable and we put it outside of any of the blocks, then we can now use it within any of the blocks. So if we saved and refreshed in the browser, you'd see it pulled in. So now what do you think would happen if we defined a new variable in here called margin and we set it to 20 pixels? What version of margin would this use? Well, it would use this version. We can prove that by refreshing the browser. So okay, that seems pretty clear, but let's show one more demonstration here. So what I'm going to do is add a border top to the site footer. I'm going to use a shorthand here, and we're going to use margin for the width of the border. We'll use red for the color and solid for the style. So we set this margin 3 pixels here, and then we set another margin here. So the question is, will this override this so that when we get to this point, we're using 20 pixels instead of the original 3? Or is this variable actually different because it's inside this block, and so it only works in the scope of this block, and so instead it will use this? Well, take a guess, save, and then let's refresh the browser. So it looks like the border is only 3 pixels. So what this demonstrates is that we can safely use any variable name within the context of one of these blocks without worrying about overriding more global variables. Now, if you decided you actually did want to override this global variable right here, which would be a little odd, but let's say you did, then you can use the global keyword. So if we use the keyword global with an exclamation mark at the end of a variable assignment like this, and we saved it, you'd see that now, when we use the margin, it's set to 20 pixels. Because here we weren't setting this unique variable just inside this block, we were using the global variable and adjusting the value there. Okay, I'm going to hit undo a few times to get rid of all of these definitions until we get to the point where we're using just this local margin variable and assigning it to these two properties. And ideally, when we go back to the browser and refresh, it will no longer have the border.